Hi, welcome to the High-Low Movie Club. My name is Michael Koresky. I'm here today to talk about the 1982 film Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean, directed by Robert Altman, one of the great American filmmakers. It's a long title. It's a movie that, for some reason, not a lot of people have heard of these days, but it was something of a major, small, independent film when it came out in the early 80s. The reason that I'm talking about it today is because it's a selection from my new book, Films of Endearment. The premise of this book, which I should probably mention before we get into the film, is that I went back through the 1980s and rewatched films with my mother that she originally introduced me to. The idea was to get a better sense of the decade as an important female-driven era of American studio filmmaking, while also learning more about her life that I may not have known about before. So it's part memoir and it's part cinematic analysis. And the idea was that I'm not the kind of person who can just outwardly ask my mother a lot of questions about her life. I really need a conduit, and movies provide that conduit because we have a special private language, in a sense, through film. She brought the love of film to me, and she made me the film obsessive that I am, and I've made a career out of it. At the same time, after my father's death, I wanted to learn a lot more about my mother that I was never able to learn about my father, who died at a relatively young age. And the nature of his illness precluded me from understanding much about his life. I didn't get to learn much. So this was a project, an emotional project for us, while also focusing on the art form, the popular art form, cinema, that we love so much. So this is the 1982 selection. There's one film from each year of the 1980s that we go back and revisit. And the reason I selected this one is because my mother rented it when I was very young, not really knowing exactly what it was, and brought it into the house. I think when you watch the film, you'll realize, oh, this probably isn't appropriate for a child under the age of 8. And it certainly isn't. It's a very emotionally intense film with a lot of adult ideas and a lot of interesting twists and turns that I'm not going to spoil or give away here. But it's also part of a lineage of films about women that came out in the 1980s that were extremely influential for me. Movies that, the kind of movies you don't really see much anymore. Movies that are about characters and trauma and the way that the past can shape the present. And this is a movie that has an amazing cast of women. I'll just name some. Sandy Dennis, who is an Academy Award winner. She won for 1966's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. If you remember, she plays Honey, the woman who is tormented by George and Martha in that film as the house guest. This features Cher in her first dramatic screen performance, and she's really quite breathtaking in the film. She plays Sissy. And Kathy Bates, another future Oscar winner, is given a pretty firecracker role, as you'll see when you watch the film. This is pretty early in her career. She'd been known primarily for stage work. And towering above them all, I would say, is Karen Black, an actress who has not been with us for a while. She sadly passed away, but she's a former Academy Award nominee for the great film Five Easy Pieces. And her role in this film is central and really important to both what we're going to talk about today and the overall tenor and nature of the project. Robert Altman's cinema is often based on ensemble work. And as you'll see, this is a real ensemble film. Some of his great films include MASH and Nashville and The Long Goodbye and Three Women, which is a great film from '77 with Sissy Spacek and Shelley Duvall. This film was coming after his heyday. Robert Altman is known primarily for his 70s work, or at least at the time. He had a nice resurgence in the 90s as well. But the 80s is generally considered sort of like an off era for him. And I think that had a lot to do with the state of the industry. For example, a lot of the auteurs who had come into their own in the 1970s because the studios were opening up to more daring films. A lot of those auteurs were not given as much interesting work in the 80s because the industry was changing so much. If you recall films like Apocalypse Now and Heaven's Gate and One from the Heart were these auteur-driven films that were considered, runaway budgets and potentially ruining the industry. So a director like Altman, who, usually kept his films under budget, nevertheless, it was not, the industry wasn't as interested in filmmakers of this sort by this time. So he turned to other venues. He started to become a theater director, and he found TV work. And one of the things that he did was this play, Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Dean, Jimmy Dean, which was a 1976 play by Ed Grachik. And he decided to perform this very strange and very interesting, all-female-driven play on Broadway. It only ran for 52 performances, yet he was so taken with the material that he wanted to make a film of it. And because he had this incredible cast assembled, and this is the cast that you see on screen, he went right into the film production after working on the stage production. So you see Sandy Dennis and Cher and Kathy Bates and Karen Black had just performed this on Broadway. He rented out a space near the theater that became the film set, and he created an amazing, interesting, gimmicky idea, which was through mirrors. The conceit of the story, as you'll see, is that it takes place in two different time periods, 1955 and 1975. And the date that connects those two is the death of James Dean, because all of the main characters in this story were part of a James Dean fan club. They were James Dean obsessives in the 50s as they were young women, and at the time one young man. And they're called the Disciples of James Dean. And they have reunited 20 years later to mourn and celebrate the death of James Dean. So that's the 1975 part. The way that Altman constructed the set is, instead of actually doing flashbacks, he wanted it all to happen at once. So you would be able to go in and out of time without there being any kind of, editing or transition between the two. So he constructed a gimmick mirror. So in other words, if they're on one side of the mirror, they're in one era. And if they're on the other side of the mirror, it's the past. And they don't even change clothes sometimes. So it takes a leap of faith on the audience's part to realize that they are now playing young. So within a scene, you'll suddenly see the actors behind the mirror, and suddenly you'll realize that it is supposed to be the 1950s. So this is a really interesting visual idea, and it makes it feel kind of like a play, because it's all happening on set as opposed to being camera tricks or cutting tricks. The character who holds this together is, like I mentioned before, played by Karen Black. So the idea of this is that you have these women who are all in some way traumatized by something from the past. With Mona, played by Sandy Dennis, it is about her son. And she has the story that she went out to see James Dean acting in Giant, his last film Giant, which was being shot in Marfa, which is a Texas town close to the small town where this movie is set. And that she became impregnated by James Dean. And nobody believes this story, but she has this son that she claims is the illegitimate son of James Dean. And then you have Cher, who plays the character of Sissy, and she has her own traumas around her body that you'll see as the film goes on, things that she tries to hide from the world. And then there's a visitor named Joanne who has come back to this reunion. And Joanne is a fascinating, layered character. And slowly the women come to realize that this is someone that is familiar, this is someone that they know, yet they don't quite recognize her as herself, as this Joanne character. And all I'll say, without giving too much away, is that this is one of the first sympathetic, multidimensional trans characters in American cinema. And I was actually talking to a trans critic friend of mine recently, And because we were talking about this film, actually, and I'm sort of fascinated by the fact that even in 1982, when these, we were not, the culture was not particularly sympathetic to trans characters. Even 2 years earlier, the film Dressed to Kill by Brian De Palma came out, which is about a murderous, it's a psycho riff that's about a murderous trans woman. However, in this case, this is a really interesting, surprisingly well-researched and multi-layered character. And as this trans critic friend of mine, Willow, wrote just this week, this is the only performance by a cisgender actor playing a trans character that she says she loves without reservation. And that's a pretty fascinating thing. And if you watch Karen Black's performance, you'll see that there is a great deal of sensitivity and a great deal of nuance to the role. And I think that the nuance is important to keep in mind here, and the small little qualities that that one can bring to a performance, why those are important, because this is a film of big emotions. As you watch it unfold and as you see the twists kind of pour out of the characters one by one and you learn more and more about their pasts, it can be a little overwhelming in the way that a play can be sometimes, where you just have revelation after revelation. It's sort of exhilarating that way, and a thrilling film in many ways. And I think what's most thrilling about it is the fact that it's so focused on women, and it's so much about women and their plight and their traumas and their past and their joys. And I just love this film so much, and I love watching it, and I'm looking forward to watching it with you, and I'm looking forward to giving you little kinds of tidbits and information as we watch. Cher was actually nominated for a Golden Globe for this role, for Best Supporting Actress, even though I would say that it's an ensemble, which they're all kind of the lead. But it's actually a fairly magnificent performance, considering that this was her first screen role, her first dramatic screen role. It's actually kind of astonishing and points towards really a wonderful career that she would have mostly in the 80s and early 90s on screen. And she would win for Moonstruck just 4 years later, which is pretty amazing. So that's all I'm going to say right now, because I think I've talked a little too long. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you enjoy Films of Endearment. It's a movie that's obviously very dear to my heart, and it's a book that's very dear to my heart. And all these movies are very dear to my heart, including the one you're about to watch. And I really do think Altman is one of the great American filmmakers. And even in small films like this, you can see why. The way that the camera moves, the way that the set is utilized, the way that the actors are directed, the way that he has just such empathy and sympathy for everybody on screen. It's really quite remarkable. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoy, and I will be back somewhere in the ether of the internet to talk about this movie. So thank you.